The Black Stallion had been a menace at Lonear Ranch for 6 weeks, striking fear into every hand and animal that crossed its path. When a small 10-year-old boy named Luke Chapman arrived one Tuesday afternoon with his elderly guardian, the claim that he could calm the wild horse sounded like a child's fantasy, until he walked across the yard and stepped to the fence where the veteran quarter horses huddled in alarm. Ranch owner Harrison Mitchell watched from his porch as the Mustang stood alone in the distant pasture, a dark figure under the desert sun with a coat like midnight and muscles that rippled with restless power. No one had been able to come within 50 feet of that stallion without being charged or chased away. The horse's movement was more like a stalking panther than a domestic animal, and the 3 professional wranglers who had been injured trying to catch him were proof of how dangerous he could be. Harrison called out from the porch, his voice carrying a lifetime of ranching authority. He told the boy to stay back, warning that the stallion was dangerous. Luke turned slowly, his eyes carrying a seriousness that seemed older than his years, and said that the horse was not dangerous but was protecting something. The idea of the animal guarding a loss or an absence chilled Harrison more than any tale of hooves and bites. The boy's face and manner seemed to awaken an old memory in Harrison's mind. There was something familiar about him. The lean rider's build, the quiet, confident posture, the way he held himself around horses. Harrison lowered himself from the porch and stepped toward the fence to get a closer look. Luke spoke of pain and losing everything, words that hit like cold wind. Mrs. Lacey, the older woman who had come as the boy's guardian after answering a household ad, had said little about the child's past beyond that he was an orphan. Now Harrison saw resilience and the marks of a life that had demanded too much of a 10-year-old. When Harrison explained that the stallion had shown up 3 weeks earlier and had been attacking stock and tearing through fences, Luke reacted with alarm. He asked what animal control would do, and when Harrison told him that the state's options could include euthanizing the horse, the boy's face crumpled. Those raw emotions moved Harrison in a way he did not expect, and before the older man could stop him, the boy stepped closer to the fence despite sharp warnings to keep away. The stallion, once aggressive and hostile, suddenly showed curiosity rather than rage. He walked up to the fence and stopped just out of reach. The boy spoke in a voice barely audible over the desert breeze. He told the horse he knew fear and loss. The stallion's head lifted, nostrils flared, and for the first time since it had arrived, it lowered its guard to examine this child. Harrison watched, amazed and uneasy, as the horse's hostility melted into cautious interest. Mrs. Lacey wrapped her shawl tighter as she told Harrison that Luke had been with her only 6 months, and that the child had suffered great losses after his parents' deaths in a car accident the year before. He had spent months in the hospital and then had no one to take him in. Harrison felt a knot of sympathy and an echo of something older as Mrs. Lacey mentioned that Luke's father had worked with wild horses in northern Nevada. That fragment of information struck like lightning, pulling a memory out of Harrison's past. 15 years earlier, a young man named David Chapman had worked at Lonear Ranch for a time, specializing in gentling mustangs. He had been passionate about mustang conservation and had left to start a sanctuary. His kindness with horses had connected with Harrison's teenage daughter, Claire, in a way Harrison had not understood at the time. Mrs. Lacey confirmed the name, David Chapman. Harrison's legs nearly failed him with the weight of the recognition. He had known David. That night, after the boy reluctantly went inside for dinner, Harrison sat on his porch in darkness, wrestling with ghosts he had kept at the edge of memory for more than a decade. 15 years earlier, Claire had been a grieving, angry 16-year-old, still raw from her mother's death and furious over the family's move to the ranch. David had been 22, soft-spoken and kind with the wild horses the Bureau of Land Management had placed on Lonear. Claire had come alive in his presence, and Harrison had watched their bond form with a protective fury he now regretted. The night Harrison discovered the two meeting in secret, his fear and anger boiled over. He had accused David of wrongdoing, threatened him, and fired him without hearing more than a protest. He had driven David away that very night, and 3 days later Claire ran off with only a note saying she was going to find David and that Harrison would never see her again. Harrison had spent years and thousands of dollars trying to locate her and had failed. Now, sitting on that porch with the desert air cooling around him, the possibility that Luke might be connected to Claire and David flooded him with a mix of dread and hope. The next morning brought a commotion that pulled Harrison from sleep. Ranch hands clustered near the pasture fence, pointing and whispering excitedly. From his bedroom window, Harrison saw Luke standing at the rail and the midnight stallion calm and close by, as if the animal had chosen to stand guard at the boy's side. Pete Rodriguez, the foreman, shrugged and shook his head, saying the kid had walked out and the horse came up like a trained companion. Harrison stepped down to the fence and asked Luke questions that pulled at the threads of memory. Luke answered that his father had told stories about working on a ranch in Arizona, about a place called Lonear, and about mustangs. When Harrison asked directly if his father was David Chapman, the boy nodded. He described life in Nevada with his parents, how David had spoken of a girl named Claire, and how they had married when Claire turned 18. The news hit Harrison like a blow. Claire was not only alive in memory but had become a mother, and the child standing before him was the grandson he had never known. The revelation left Harrison speechless as the enormity of 15 wasted years of searching and longing crashed over him. Luke said his mother had told him they had no family, that she and his father had been his whole world. It was a cut Harrison could not fix in that moment. Claire had cut ties so completely that she had withheld any mention of family from her son. Mrs. Lacey stepped close, tears in her eyes, and told a painful truth that tied together the boy's nightmares and his longing. Since the accident, Luke had nightmares not just of losing his parents, but of a ranch and horses and a feeling that someone was waiting. Counselors had dismissed the dreams as trauma, but Mrs. Lacey had recognized recurring details in the letters Claire had once written. The stallion whimpered and began to pace more urgently, then pawed the ground while staring toward the northern hills of the ranch. Luke listened, eyes bright with understanding. He told Harrison that the horse wanted to go somewhere, that it was trying to lead them. Harrison hesitated, then decided to follow. He had the ATV readied and told Pete to prepare it, taking Luke along despite some skepticism from the crew. The Black Stallion moved with purposeful direction, stopping now and then to make sure they followed, leading them across desert terrain toward rocky outcrops at the ranch boundary. As they rode, the boy finally called Harrison Grandpa for the first time. The two spoke of the past, him of the fear that forced a cruel decision and the deep regret that had followed, Luke of a father who had been wise and kind. Harrison confessed to mistakes made in anger, to a pride that had kept him from seeing David's true character, and to driving away the people who mattered most. Luke listened with the gravity of a child who had grown up faster than the years allowed. They followed the stallion deeper into hills Harrison had avoided for years because they hid dangerous drop-offs and treacherous paths. The horse moved like a guide, undeterred by the rough ground. After nearly an hour, the stallion stopped at the mouth of a narrow canyon Harrison recognized as Devil's Canyon, a place of bare rock and hidden places. Luke slipped from the ATV and walked to the horse, running a small hand along the animal's neck, as if reconnecting to something the world had severed. The boy said the animal was not simply leading them, it was taking them home. He remembered a hidden valley where his parents had brought him as a small child, a place his father had studied to learn about wild horse behavior, a secret retreat carved into the canyon with water, shelter, and a kind of hush that protected life from the rest of the world. The stallion led them along a path too narrow for the vehicle, through rising walls that swallowed much of the afternoon light, and gave the sense of stepping into a protected space. The sound of running water grew until the valley opened into view, a 2-acre pocket of green cradled by sheer rock walls. A clear spring bubbled up and formed a stream that fed the grass and trees. Cottonwoods provided shade and wildflowers nodded by the water. Nestled beneath the largest cottonwood was a small cabin with a corral nearby and signs of recent habitation. On a wooden sign over the cabin door, a phrase told the story without fanfare: the Chapman family sanctuary, a place where wild hearts run free. The sight struck their hearts hard. The cabin held furniture, books, small domestic items, the visible evidence that someone had lived here quietly and with love. Luke moved to the back of the cabin and led Harrison around to a grove of aspens where 3 simple wooden crosses marked grave. 2 had names carved and dates from the previous year: David Chapman and Claire Mitchell Chapman. The 3rd cross was smaller and unmarked, prepared for an intended future occupant. Harrison dropped to his knees, the weight of 15 years of grief and regret breaking like a dam. Claire had taken David's name as well as keeping Mitchell, a sign of complicated loyalties and lingering ties. Luke told Harrison in a voice both young and steady that Mrs. Lacey had helped him bring his parents' bodies here from Nevada after funeral services. They had done it quietly, because that was what David and Claire would have wanted, to be buried in the hidden valley where they had loved one another and raised a son. The boy had been the one to fulfill that last wish, arranging the secret return as an act of devotion beyond his years. Harrison felt both admiration and a crushing sorrow for the time lost. They sat by the grave in silence for a long while, listening to the spring's steady murmur and watching the Black Stallion move to the stream. As they watched, other horses emerged from the far end of the valley, mares with foals and a few younger stallions who approached the black horse with deferential gestures. Luke explained that the Midnight Stallion was their laid, that when the Bureau had begun another roundup, the horse had led his herd to this sheltered valley for safety. But drought had limited the spring's flow, and the herd could not risk leaving the canyon because helicopters and capture teams hovered and searched the open valleys. The stallion had been pushing at the ranch's boundary in recent weeks to find water and test safety, and when help failed to arrive in any other form, he had waited for the one human who could bridge the space between wildness and trust. Luke was that bridge. Harrison felt the truth settle around him like dust. The stallion had not been a marauder but a messenger. He needed assurance that this land could be a refuge and that the herd would be protected from capture and given access to water. Harrison thought of his acres spread wide across drought-stricken land, and of his daughter who had loved horses more deeply than anyone he had known. He thought of the grandson now standing before him who shared that ancestral understanding. Without hesitation, Harrison promised sanctuary. He promised that the ranch would offer safe pasture, protected water, and a legal shield against the roundup teams, and he promised that Luke would be there to help care for the wild herd. The stallion's answer was immediate and unmistakable, a loud trumpeting call that echoed off the canyon walls and was answered by the herd. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the stallion and his family followed them back toward the ranch, moving now with a calm confidence. Luke asked if he could stay on the ranch, help care for the animals, and learn all the skills of ranch life. Harrison, feeling the years of empty days and the sudden, deep rightness of the boy's presence, replied that the ranch was a family legacy and that someday it could be his. More immediately, Harrison said the boy was needed on the place he had returned to. Mrs. Lacey agreed to remain as housekeeper and grandmother figure, completing a circle of care that made the boy's future secure. Over the next weeks, the ranch transformed as plans were made to give the wild herd expanded pastures and reliable water. The Black Stallion, named Shadow by the boy for his dark coat, stayed close to Luke and even assisted in gentling other horses. The boy's uncanny understanding of equine behavior astonished veteran hands, and led to a program for introducing and training mustangs safely that attracted attention across the region. In 3 months, the change was visible. Lonar's creeks were rerouted carefully to support the valley spring. New corral systems were built that allowed wild herd members to choose space without feeling trapped, and public education efforts began to shift the conversation about wild horse protection in the area. Luke proved to be a natural horseman, teaching the ranch hands techniques learned from his father: soft approaches, patient trust building, and keen observation. He combined those methods with his own instincts, creating a gentle, effective way to welcome wary mustangs into the ranch while preserving their wild spirit. Harrison watched the boy from the porch one warm afternoon, observing him as he worked a frightened young mustang with patience and a calm touch. Mrs. Lacey stood beside Harrison, handing him 2 cups of coffee, and commented on how much Luke resembled his parents. Harrison agreed that both David and Claire were visible in the boy's gestures and temperament. They spoke quietly about the future, wondering whether Luke would always be drawn to wild places or whether he might one day choose to see the world beyond the ranch. Harrison felt certain that whatever paths Luke followed, he would carry Lonar in his bones and always return. Evenings became pilgrimages to the hidden valley. Luke placed wildflowers at his parents' grave, bringing a fresh bouquet each time. He spoke softly to the memorials, telling them small stories of the day and what he had learned. He told the stallion things too, a nightly ritual of recapping the hours and showing gratitude for the horse that had guided him home when he needed it most. The boy believed that his parents had somehow guided Shadow to the ranch after the accident, and though the idea seemed like fate, it also felt like the only explanation that matched the odd sequence of events. Harrison, moved by a need to make lasting amends, began the work of protecting the herd through legal channels, writing letters to officials and organizations, and updating his own will so that Luke and the sanctuary would be secure. He wrote a letter he had carried in his chest for 15 years, a letter to the 2 people who had been the center of the loss and the healing, placing it in his desk to be read aloud at the grave. The ranch itself grew into a recognized sanctuary in the year that followed. Luke, now 11, became known for a rare ability to communicate with wild mustangs. Trainers, researchers, and writers came to Lonar to learn about the gentling program and to study the behavior of wild herds that had adapted to life on a sanctuary that respected their nature. Educational groups and university researchers visited, schoolchildren came for guided tour, and the ranch hosted public forums about humane strategies for conservation. The Black Stallion Shadow became a symbol of successful coexistence, a sire of horses that combined stamina and wildness with a temperament that allowed them to thrive on a working ranch without losing their spirit. On the anniversary of David and Claire's death, Luke stood by their grave and read a letter he had written to them, a simple, heartfelt account of his life and of the ways in which their legacy lived on. He spoke of the ranch, his training work, and the grandfather who had finally become family. He said he wanted them to know he was happy and that he felt he belonged. Shadow lingered nearby as if he understood the solemnity of the moment, a dark silhouette against the bright stream and green grass. The stallion's presence at the gravesite was a reminder of the strange paths that led a boy back to his roots and a family back to the place where forgiveness could begin. Harrison often wondered aloud about what might have happened if the stallion had not appeared at the doorstep that day. Luke answered with a child's steady certainty that some things find their own way. Love finds a path, even when it seems impossible or blocked by fear and pride. The ranch that had once housed only grief and regret became a place of healing and refuge. Wild herds found sanctuary, and the wounded spirits who tended them found a road back to one another. Luke's arrival mended a family that had been torn by anger and misunderstanding, and his gift with horses ensured that the wild animals who once inspired fear now inspired hope. Seasons passed and the sanctuary grew, but at its heart remained a small grove with 2 grave and a 3rd cross waiting as a quiet promise. The life that followed was not devoid of sorrow, but it contained a steady stream of small joys, training days that ended with a herd moving peacefully across open pasture, evenings at the cabin where stories were told and lessons were passed on, and nights when a small boy whispered thanks to a stallion who had led him home. This story of a black stallion, a boy, and a ranch that became a refuge shows that second chances can be found in stubborn animals, in unspoken apologies, and in the patient work of rebuilding trust. If this tale moved the heart, consider supporting the continuity of stories like this by subscribing, tapping like, and sharing this video with someone who needs a reminder that lost ties can be mended and that compassion can change a life.